For years, British politics has spoken about the cost of living crisis as though it were a passing storm, unpleasant, unavoidable, and eventually destined to blow over. Ministers have pointed to inflation falling, wages rising, and economic growth returning. Yet millions of households have continued to feel that the numbers being celebrated in Westminster bear little resemblance to the numbers appearing on their energy bills, rent demands, supermarket receipts, and bank statements. A recent James O'Brien discussion was prompted by one sentence from Britain's new Prime Minister. Andy Burnham said the country needed a cost of living government. Not merely a government with one cost of living policy, but an administration whose decisions would be judged against the pressure being felt inside ordinary homes. It is a powerful phrase. It is also an unintentionally revealing one, because when a new Prime Minister announces that Britain now requires a cost of living government, the obvious question is, what exactly did Britain have before? Andy Burnham entered Downing Street on the 20th of July 2026, becoming the seventh British Prime Minister since the referendum of 2016. In his first speech, he promised a political and economic circuit breaker, more power outside Westminster, and immediate breathing space for households. Within 48 hours, his government had announced two highly visible measures: the removal of VAT from domestic electricity bills from the 1st of October, and the restoration of a £2 cap on most single bus fares in England from January 2027. These announcements are not meaningless, but neither are they remotely large enough by themselves to justify the grand title of a cost of living government. The electricity VAT cut is expected to cost the Treasury approximately £850 million and reduce the average annual energy bill by around £45. That is less than £1 a week. For a household counting every pound, £45 is still £45. It could cover several days of food, part of a school uniform, or a small emergency expense. Dismissing it entirely would be easy for those who do not have to calculate whether the heating can remain on for another hour. But context changes everything. From July to September 2026, Ofgem's energy price cap for a typical household paying by direct debit stands at £1,862 a year. That followed a 13% increase from the previous cap period. Money expert Martin Lewis has warned that the expected October rise in the cap could be around 5.1%, while removing VAT from electricity produces a reduction of roughly 4.8% on that part of the bill. In other words, the approaching price increase could wipe out the government's headline saving before many households have even felt it. And this VAT cut applies to electricity, not the entire combined gas and electricity bill. It offers relief, but it does not alter the international wholesale markets, the standing charge system, the condition of Britain's housing stock, or the fundamental exposure of households to future energy shocks. So the policy is best understood as a signal. Burnham is telling the public that his government's first instinct will be to examine household bills rather than simply repeat national economic statistics. Politically, that may be intelligent. Economically, it is only an opening move. The second announcement may have a more noticeable effect for frequent bus users. From the 1st of January 2027, most single fares outside London will again be capped at £2 rather than £3 for the remainder of the year. The government says the policy will be backed by £400 million and notes that the previous £2 scheme generated an estimated 30 million additional bus journeys in 10 months. For someone taking two capped journeys on 5 working days every week, the difference between £3 and £2 could theoretically be £10 a week, or hundreds of pounds over a year. That is far more tangible than £45 off an annual electricity bill. It also reflects Burnham's record in Greater Manchester, where he brought buses back under public control through the B network and treated affordable transport as part of the economic infrastructure of the region. A cheaper bus is not merely a transport policy. It affects whether someone can afford to reach work, attend college, visit a hospital, search for employment, or maintain family responsibilities. Yet here too, the headline is not the whole story. A £2 fare is useless where the bus has been withdrawn, arrives too infrequently, stops running before a shift finishes, or never served the community in the first place. Rural authorities have already warned that cheaper fares must be matched by fare funding to maintain routes. The fare cap can reduce the price of a journey, but it cannot substitute for a functioning network. This distinction matters because the modern British cost of living crisis is not simply a story about inflation. It is a story about the total relationship between prices, incomes, taxes, housing, public services, and economic security. The latest headline inflation figure appears encouraging. Consumer price inflation fell to 2.6% in June 2026, while food and non-alcoholic drink inflation slowed to 1.7%. But falling inflation does not mean prices have fallen, it means they are rising more slowly. The Office for National Statistics estimates that household costs increased by roughly 34% over the 5 years to March 2026. For low-income households, cumulative cost inflation was 33.9%. A family that was already living close to the edge did not receive a 34% increase in financial resilience. The prices went up, and largely stayed up. This is why political claims about bringing inflation down so often irritate the public. A supermarket product that rose from £2 to £3 during the inflation shock does not return to £2 when inflation falls. It may simply rise from £3 to £3 and 5 pence instead of £3 and 20 pence. Housing presents the same problem. The average private rent across the United Kingdom reached approximately £1,388 a month in June 2026, an annual increase of 3.3%. In England, the average was £1,446. A renter receiving a £45 annual saving on electricity could lose more than that in a single month through a routine rent increase. The labour market is not providing a dramatic escape route. Regular pay grew by 3.4% in the 3 months to May, but after adjusting for housing-inclusive inflation, real regular pay growth was only 0.3%. Unemployment stood at 4.9%. The provisional payroll estimate for June was 71,000 lower than a year earlier, while vacancies fell to 712,000. So yes, wages are edging ahead of inflation. But for many workers, the improvement is barely perceptible, especially after tax, rent, transport, childcare, debt repayments, and the lingering price increases of the previous 5 years. The lived experience is visible in the Office for National Statistics' own public survey. In May, 66% of adults said their cost of living had increased compared with the previous month. 41% said they were spending less on food shopping and essentials. 35% were using less gas or electricity at home. 1/4 said their household could not meet an unexpected but necessary expense of £850. Around 1 in 12 adults reported being unable to buy or access essential food items during the previous 2 weeks. Those are not abstract percentages. They represent millions of households adapting their lives around scarcity. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's Summer 2026 tracker presents an even harsher picture among low-income families. It estimates that 7.4 million low-income families were unable to afford at least one essential item during the previous 6 months, the highest number recorded since the survey began in 2021. Around 4.5 million were behind on at least one household bill or debt repayment. Approximately 1.5 million had used a food bank. Trussell Food Banks distributed more than 2.6 million emergency food parcels during 2025, including more than 900,000 for children. Official government figures show that 4.5 million children were living in relative low income after housing costs in 2023 to 2024, around 31% of all children. This is the country Burnham has inherited. Not an economy in which every indicator is collapsing, but one in which national improvement coexists with household emergency. That makes the phrase cost of living government both necessary and dangerous. It is necessary because government should recognize that economic success means little if ordinary people cannot afford the essentials of life. But it is dangerous because once a prime minister places those words at the center of his administration, every decision becomes measurable against them. A government cannot call itself a cost of living government while allowing housing costs to consume ever larger shares of income. It cannot celebrate a £45 energy saving while tax thresholds quietly pull more workers into higher bills. It cannot reduce bus fares while routes disappear. It cannot promise help at the supermarket while the basic rate of universal credit remains below independently estimated essential living costs. and it cannot pretend that every promise can be funded by cancelling a program that may never have had fully committed funding in the first place. Burnham's government says the electricity VT cut will be financed by scrapping the previous digital identification program. Yet Darren Jones, the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, has argued that the Digital ID project was unfunded, meaning there may be no existing pot of money to transfer. The VAT policy may still be affordable, but the funding explanation must survive scrutiny. That concern becomes larger when the government's other ambitions are considered. The £2 bus cap requires £400 million. Hundreds of millions have also been discussed for tackling rough sleeping. Burnham has spoken about council housing, social care, regional investment, and wider changes to the economic model. Ministers have therefore been instructed to examine their departmental budgets and find savings. There is nothing inherently wrong with changing priorities. That is what governments are supposed to do. Spending less on one program in order to spend more on another can be responsible government. But reprioritization is one of Westminster's most flexible words. It can mean cancelling waste. It can also mean reducing a service that has no powerful political constituency, transferring pressure to local councils, delaying maintenance, or expecting public bodies to deliver the same work with less money. Britain's public finances offer limited room for fantasy. The Office for Budget Responsibility projected borrowing of around £133 billion in 2025-26. That interest spending reached approximately £110 billion, making it the third largest area of public expenditure after health and welfare. Public debt is forecast to remain close to 95% of national income by the end of the forecast period. Meanwhile, the tax burden is already expected to reach a post-war record. Frozen income tax thresholds continue to raise revenue by pulling more earnings into taxation as wages rise. Raising the personal allowance would help many workers, but it would also cost billions and provide nothing directly to adults whose incomes are too low to pay income tax. This is the central dilemma Burnham must solve. Universal relief is politically simple and reaches middle-income households who also feel squeezed. Targeted relief delivers more money to those in greatest need, but can create complexity, gaps, and resentment among people just outside the qualifying line. Tax cuts can increase take-home pay, but they may weaken the revenue needed for public services. Price subsidies offer immediate comfort, but without structural reform, they can become expensive attempts to stand still. A genuine cost of living program therefore needs more than a collection of discounts. It requires a strategy. First, energy policy must separate emergency relief from long-term security. Removing VAT can soften one bill. It cannot protect Britain from the next global price shock. That requires warmer homes, greater energy efficiency, reform of standing charges, more reliable domestic generation, storage, and grid investment, alongside targeted protection for households that cannot afford basic energy use. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has proposed an affordable energy guarantee, under which a basic amount of energy would be supplied more cheaply, with additional support linked to need. Whether Burnham adopts that exact model or not, the principle deserves attention. Essential consumption should be protected more strongly than unlimited consumption. Second, income policy must confront the gap between official benefit levels and the actual cost of essentials. Research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Trussell estimates that a single adult requires at least £120 a week for essentials, while the basic universal credit allowance for someone over 25 is around £98. For a couple, the estimated essential requirement is £205, compared with a basic allowance of approximately £154. A system that begins below the estimated cost of food, utilities, clothing, travel, and basic household items is almost designed to produce arrears, debt, and food bank use. Stronger employment is vital, but nearly 3/4 of children in relative low income already live in working families. Work is not an automatic escape from poverty when pay is insecure and housing and childcare costs absorb the gains. Third, housing has to move from the edge of the cost of living debate to its centre. Britain cannot sustainably subsidise households against every rent increase while failing to expand the supply of secure, affordable homes. Burnham's mayoral record and council house ambition suggest he understands this. But national delivery will require land, planning capacity, construction workers, long-term finance, and local authorities capable of building at scale. Housing support must also reflect real rents. When local housing allowance falls behind the market, the gap is paid from money intended for food, heating, and every other necessity. Linking support more closely to local rental costs would relieve immediate hardship, while house building addresses the underlying shortage. Fourth, transport affordability must include availability. The £2 cap is welcome, particularly for workers and students making frequent journeys. But the next test is whether Burnham can build a national version of the logic behind Greater Manchester's B network: coordinated routes, integrated fares, local accountability and services designed around economic participation rather than only commercial viability. Fifth, the country needs wage growth that comes from productivity, investment, and better jobs rather than inflation chasing inflation. Britain's long-term living standards problem cannot be solved by repeatedly moving money between taxpayers, bill payers, and the Treasury. It requires an economy that produces more value per hour, spreads investment beyond London and the South East, and gives workers enough bargaining power to share in the gains. The outlook is hardly reassuring. The Resolution Foundation estimates that real household disposable income per person is set to rise by an average of only 0.3% a year between 2025-26 and 2029-30. That is not a recovery capable of transforming living standards. It is economic movement measured with a magnifying glass. This is where Burnham's emphasis on devolution may become more than constitutional decoration. Local and regional leaders often understand the connection between transport, housing, skills, health, and employment better than departments operating separately in Whitehall. Giving regions power without resources, however, merely decentralizes blame. Real devolution requires budgets, borrowing capacity, accountability, and measurable outcomes. The public should therefore resist two equally lazy responses to Burnham's opening agenda. The first is to dismiss every measure as a gimmick. £45 off electricity and cheaper buses will help real people. Government priorities are revealed not only by enormous reforms, but by the first problems a new administration chooses to address. The second is to mistake those opening measures for a completed plan. A less expensive bus ticket and a small energy tax reduction cannot reverse 5 years in which household costs rose by roughly 1/3. They do not answer the housing crisis, low benefit adequacy, weak productivity, insecure employment, or Britain's exposure to energy markets. Burnham deserves credit for identifying the kitchen table economy as the true test of government. Inflation charts matter, but the public experiences the economy through whether the direct debit clears, whether the fridge is stocked, whether the rent is paid, and whether there is enough left for an unexpected expense. Now he must prove that cost of living government is more than a new slogan attached to old constraints. The real judgment will come in the autumn budget. Who will pay for the promises? Which programs will be cut? Will support be universal or targeted? Will tax thresholds remain frozen? Will housing and social security be treated as central economic infrastructure? Will the government confront energy system reform or continue purchasing temporary relief whenever prices jump? And above all, what will success look like? It should not be measured by the number of announcements, the size of a press release, or the popularity of a phrase. It should be measured by fewer families going without food, fewer households in arrears, lower energy poverty, more secure housing, accessible transport, rising real disposable incomes, and a sustained reduction in child poverty. Andy Burnham has promised Britain a cost of living government. The promise is welcome. The first measures are useful. The direction is politically significant, but the crisis is measured in billions, while the first household energy saving is measured in pence per day. For Burnham, that is not a reason to abandon the mission. It is a warning about its scale, because a government that chooses to put the cost of living at the center of its identity will ultimately be judged by one brutally simple question. After the speeches, after the tax changes, after the fare caps, and after the budget, can ordinary people actually afford to live?